Hi, Emile.
Hi, nice to be
Are you
here.
good to have you? Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter, and this is the Nonzero podcast. And you are Emile P. Torres, the author most recently of the book Human Extinction: A History of the Science and Ethics of Annihilation. We will have reason to talk more about human extinction before this is over. Um, I'm very interested in this and looking forward to it because um, you are, I would say, one of the fiercest, if not the fiercest, critic of effective altruism, such related movements as long-termism, and some other ones that you see as closely related to it that we'll get into. And yet, there was a time when you were a card-carrying member of the effective altruism movement, something of a long-termist yourself. And in fact, I just went back and listened to a conversation you and I had on kind of the predecessor of this platform that evolved into the Nonzero podcast platform 6 years ago. At that point, you were at an institute co-founded by noted long-termist Nick Bostrom. You seem to have no complaints about being that. You talked about the risk of the coming risk of superintelligence, and of course that's one place where this is long-termism has entered the news in a big way with this whole debate. Some of the big AI doomers are long-termists, and we'll get into the meaning of these terms a little bit more. And of course, effective altruism first entered the, I would say, public view in a big and kind of notorious way, beginning a little more than a year ago when the Sam Bankman-Fried thing blew up, because he was a big donor, an effective altruist, a big donor to EA causes. So I want to ask you, like, what exactly happened to change your view? But first of all, let's just do a little discussion of terminology. How would you define? And I do want to get into your whole larger TESCREAL acronym, if that's how you pronounce it, but not yet. We'll get to that. For now, let's focus on long-termism, which is widely seen as a kind of a branch of effective altruism or something. That connection is widely accepted, even if the larger connections you're making to other movements may be more controversial. But we'll get into those. For now, how would you define long-termism?
Yeah. So long-termism comes in different varieties. You might distinguish between a moderate version and a radical version. The former says that shaping the far future of humanity, ensuring that the far future goes well, is a key moral priority. So that's the article used, a. Radical long-termism says it's the key moral priority for our time, this century and perhaps beyond. And really, the key idea is that the value of our actions today may be determined primarily, maybe overwhelmingly, by their further future effects. And so this is based on insights from modern cosmology, in particular a field called physical eschatology, that according to which Earth will remain habitable for roughly another billion years, maybe 800 million years, very long time. If we spread beyond Earth, then the two things. One, the universe is huge. This is a point about sort of cosmography, how big is the universe? And then temporally, along the temporal dimension, the universe itself will remain habitable for an extremely long time. So maybe 10 to the 40 years, a 1 followed by 40 zeros. That's when protons are expected to decay. But we don't know if protons decay. If they don't, then life could persist even beyond that. The heat death of the universe is supposed to happen for 10 to the 100 years. So all of that implies that if humanity survives on Earth, spreads beyond our solar system, then the future human population could be absolutely enormous. And so the reasoning is, when you have this sort of view about the habitability and size of the universe, and you combine that with the effective altruist commitment to do the most quote unquote good possible in the universe, then you get the following line of reasoning, if the goal is to positively influence the greatest number of people,
Mm-hmm.
and if most people who could exist will exist in the very far future, then maybe what you should be doing is focusing on how your actions today might affect those far future people. Because even if there's an action today that affects a tiny percentage of future people, by virtue of the fact that the number of future people could be absolutely astronomical, literally astronomical, then you may still ultimately do more good by affecting them than focusing on current day people. For example, lifting the 1.3 billion people currently in multidimensional poverty out of that poverty.
So, right. And that's why, can I say, to some extent, your critique is a critique from the left, that we're ignoring the needs of a lot of needy people. Well, that long-termism, at least taken to certain magnitudes, could wind up leading us to ignore the needs of needy people in the here and now. The idea being that, well, if we do X, Y, and Z now, which granted will exact some pain on some people, that will increase the chances of humanity surviving long enough to populate planets, getting to a point where the whole human experiment is safe and whatever kind of intelligence we evolve into flourishes and the light of consciousness spreads and so on. So it's a critique. It's a critique from the left. Right. I mean, that's fair to say.
So I think part of the critique is that it's the implication of the long-termist view that minimizes or trivializes current day problems. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Nick Bostrom refers to the worst disasters and atrocities of the 20th century as mere ripples on the surface of the great sea of life. So this, he refers in other papers to some kind of global catastrophe involving, for example, the spread of some virus, global pandemic that is non-existential in nature, as a giant misstep for a giant disaster for mankind. Mm-hmm. A giant misstep for man, a small misstep for mankind. Sorry, I did to remember
a little Neil Armstrong twist there. Okay.
Yeah, obviously reference to that. So basically, the idea is that even really large scale, horrific, catastrophic events from the grand cosmic perspective, if they're not existential, meaning that they aren't going to significantly reduce the amount of value that could exist in the future, those just kind of fade into the horizon, into nothingness. They're just not a big deal from this sort of grand, cosmic point of view. So that's one of the angles of critical attack on this particular view.
Okay. So that's long-termism. And again, it's very much part of the AI debate. Eliezer Yudkowsky is a long-termist and the kind of AI doomer in chief. And also, I should say, effective altruism entered this recent controversy at OpenAI, the drama with Sam Altman, the attempted deposing of him because at least one the main person on the board he had the most obvious friction with was an EA person, and we can get into all that. So anyway, it's all in the news. Now that we've talked about long-termism, let's talk a little about effective altruism, because again, long-termism is a kind of a branch of AI in a certain sense, of EA in a certain sense, and it wasn't an originally prominent branch. Okay, as it happens, like I see if you follow the family tree of EA to its very root. Okay, on the way you encounter such philosophers as Will MacAskill, perhaps the most prominent philosopher, EA advocate, and an official long-termist, certainly after his most recent book, What We Owe the Future. Nick Bostrom, Toby, is it Orb or Ord? What's his last name? It's
Ord.
Yeah. But if you go further, I would say you get to Peter Singer, right, with effective altruism. Now, I know Peter, as it happens, I had lunch with him yesterday. When he conceived of it, he wasn't, the long-termism thing wasn't, his main point, which people can now kind of try to trivialize, but he was saying, like, a lot of people give money and feel great about themselves, but a lot of people, if your goal is to maximize the benefit for human well-being, and Peter being utilitarian, that's the way he sees the goal. Maybe you're not spending your money that well. I mean, you should ask yourself, like, is the art museum that caters to affluent people the thing more in need of your money than, say, more mosquito nets in Africa? And he'd say the same thing about the Make-A-Wish Foundation. It's great. It's great to make one kid with cancer happy for a day or two, but if you're spending like $500,000 doing it, maybe there's another way to spend your money. These seem to be very reasonable questions. You can do what you will with them once they've been called to your attention, but it was a much more modest enterprise in a certain sense when it began. And then at some point, long-termism, which I have sympathy with in principle, I should say. I mean, I don't want to see us end all life on Earth or even just the human species. And one reason is the future generations to come that could otherwise benefit and so on. So I want to emphasize that, EA has evolved, and that's an interesting thing. And maybe when you start talking about its evolution, you will get into the question I want to eventually ask you about your own alienation from the movement. I don't know, but what do you want to say about all that?
Yeah, so I think that's right. Initially, EA was kind of founded around 2009. Giving What We Can was the first EA organization, co-founded by Toby Ord and Will McCaskill, who you mentioned earlier. But the genealogy, the lineage of thinking that led to EA does go back quite directly to a 1972 paper written by Peter Singer on affluence, famine, and morality. And so it was this paper that, of course, he introduced the famous drowning child scenario to try to motivate his conclusion that spatial distance shouldn't matter. So if there's somebody who's a child, anybody on the other side of,
and the idea is, if you saw a drowning child and somebody said, if you'll trade in your Mercedes for a Chevy, you can save that child, you'd say yes. Was that the gist of it? And
the gist of it.
And he's saying, in effect, you face that choice. You could take money you're using for, things that don't really enrich your life all that much, and you could save a bunch of children. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're 10 feet away from a child who happens to be drowning in a lake, let's say you just bought new pants and shoes and so on. Most people wouldn't hesitate to ruin their new clothes to go and save.
Okay, that was the exact thing. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what does it matter that there are children who are, 3,000 miles away? What does spatial distance have to do with ethics? And so that was the idea. So maybe what you should do is not buy the expensive pants and shoes that you don't need in the first place and take that money and donate it to save a child. So that is the altruism part. If you're sold then on Singer's argument and you say, okay, I agree, I want to be an altruist, there's a further question that he didn't really explore that much, which is, who do I donate my money to? What are actually the most effective ways of saving a child on the other side of the world? And so that was sort of what was novel about effective altruism, is this attempt to use quantitative tools, qualities and dailies. These are sort of metrics for trying to compare benefits and harms across people and illnesses and situations and so on, and use the tools of decision theory, expected value theory in particular, to ultimately to then rank different charities according to their effectiveness. There are a lot of problems with the way that they rank these charities, because there is a very strong quantitative bias. But nonetheless, this was the idea. Okay, I'm sold on Singer's argument. I want to be an altruist. Second question, how do I be the best altruist I can possibly be? How do I maximize my altruistic efforts in the world? And so that was the idea behind effective altruism. And really it was, so initially the focus was almost entirely on alleviating global poverty. Later on, they added animal welfare, so ending factory farming. Some of them are even concerned about wild
I mean, of
animal
course,
suffering.
Peter, in a way, first gained public renown for writing the book Animal Liberation a long time ago, which became kind of the Bible of the animal rights movement, laid out the logic behind taking the phrase animal rights as opposed to just animal welfare seriously. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, some EAs are, even concerned about wild animal suffering, the suffering of shrimp. Maybe their suffering is very.
That's where I draw the line personally, but it's up to them.
Yeah. So,
which
maybe
animals they worry about.
right.
Okay.
And given, their sort of quantitative, generally utilitarian approach, the reasoning is like, okay, shrimp, maybe they suffer very little, but the fact that there are so many of them, the total quantity of suffering might actually be, significant. And so later on, then, a few years after EA was sort of founded, some of these EAs began to read the work of Nick Bostrom. And Nick Bostrom integrated these insights from modern cosmology, I mentioned the field of physical eschatology, into a broadly kind of utilitarian framework. And so then they started to realize, okay, yeah, actually, if most people who could exist will exist in the far future, millions, billions, and trillions of years from now. And if my goal is to do the most good possible, maybe I should be focusing on those far future people rather than current day people. And that's how the long-termist cause area, as they would refer to it, was born. And then over the past like 5 years, long-termism has become, like, the EA community as a whole has started to shift more towards long-termist, particular long-termist projects, causes, and so on, and away from the more traditional EA focus on global poverty and animal welfare.
And so last time I talked to you, as I said, 6 years ago, you were a happy colleague of Nick Bostrom's at the very institute he co-founded. Now, what happened?
Yeah, and so just to be clear, I was a visitor at the Future of Humanity Institute.
Yeah, but you were kind of talking the talk. When I said, what are the greatest threats to humankind? You said, well, if you want to think super long term, I would say, super intelligence is certainly, super intelligent AI is certainly in the running. You were not filled with discontent about the EA and long-termist movement. So, something has changed. Also, at that point, you were going by Phil. What has changed? Is this like a total? So your name is Émile Philip Torres, is that right?
So legal name is Philip Torres.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. You've changed your legal name?
So I'll explain that in a moment.
Okay.
So just to be clear, I just wanted to be more precise about how long I was at this particular institute, FHI.
Okay.
So that was a fairly brief stay. I was in the long-termist community for a decade or so. I mean, I initially encountered long-termism through transhumanism because there's a very tight link.
Which, by the way, is the T in your acronym TESCREAL, which we will eventually unfold entirely. Go ahead.
Yeah, from transhumanism to long-termism. The T.
Right, and you see this as kind of an interconnected. You see it as one big kind of blob of people. Not to minimize the sophistication of your worldview, but it's kind of that, right? It's like this network of. It's almost like everyone who's in this space has a little of all these letters in them, even if not all of all these letters. I don't know.
So I would want to add some nuance. Well, I don't want to put it that way because that sounds condescending. I don't mean it like that at all.
Yeah.
But so I mean the TESCREAL acronym that was introduced during a collaboration I was part of with Dr. Timnit Gebru, a computer scientist who's fired from Google, and
well-known AI ethics person who. Did she co-coin the phrase stochastic parrots or something? Or did she?
So that was actually Emily Bender's term.
Oh, but she was on the paper. She was a co-author of the paper in which it was rolled out. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And so we were specifically trying to understand what are the various ideologies that are shaping and have driven the current race to build AGI. And so the claim isn't that like this is just these ideologies form just kind of like a single blob. It's that there are strains of these ideologies that are absolutely crucial to understand how we got to where we are. Why is AGI on the map to begin with? You have people like Yudkowsky out there arguing that AGI, we're on the verge of perhaps creating AGI. If we do, it's going to kill everybody on Earth. But historically, I mean, he was part of a movement of people that were pushing for the development of AGI.
Yeah, he's like the reverse image of you. He was on my podcast sometime long ago, and he was in mid-transition. He wasn't a doomer yet, but he was starting to sound cautionary notes about AI. So you and he like live in some kind of quantum entanglement thing going on here where you are complementary. But
a lot of these people, just to add real fast, were accelerationists before they were doomers. And the term doomer is perhaps a bit misleading because these individuals remain accelerationists about pretty much everything except for AGI and a small handful of similar advanced emerging or anticipated future technologies. Yeah. So like molecular nanotechnology would be another example.
And by the way, accelerationism is now officially in the lexicon because the New York Times, you may have seen this piece, only a couple of days ago did the piece introducing accelerationism as an idea in the tech world. These are the people who want to speed up technological evolution. Okay, go ahead. And by the way, before long, we should get back to the point where I interrupted you, where you mentioned the word transhumanism, and we got off on this, Chad. You were talking about your own personal journey, but go ahead and finish up what you're saying, and then we can get back to your own personal journey.
Yeah, no, we'll circle back around, I'm sure, to accelerationism and doomerism and the connections between the two. So, yeah, I mean, I would say that, the whole reason I was at FHI, Future of Man Institute, for a week was to give a talk. The reason I was asked to give a talk is because I had been a researcher immersed in this long-termist community long before there was a word for before long-termism, the term was a bit more cumbersome, which is people who study existential risk. So that was me. My work focused on existential risk for, years. I mean, almost a decade. And then, since, around maybe 2018, especially 2019, I have completely changed my opinion about the value and goodness of the existential risk program.
Okay. And what induced the transformation?
Yeah, so there were a few causes. One was a realization that I part of it. So this is the most embarrassing aspect of why I changed my views. I started to read seriously and to talk with scholars who basically aren't white men, and realized that the utopian vision, which is at the very heart of transhumanism and the long-termist vision, is, in my judgment, just deeply impoverished. I mean, it was crafted by almost entirely by white men at privileged white men at elite universities like Oxford and in Silicon Valley. It's deeply capitalistic. It's extremely Baconian. It's very colonialist in its with respect to its core commitments.
You're saying this long-termism itself has these properties?
Vision of the future, which is
Well, do you mean utopianism? Because those are very different things. I mean, some long-termists are almost the opposite of utopians. They're dystopians. They think that we are headed for a dystopia and we have to intervene. We need regulation at the national level and the international level. Actually, I think we need that for AI. Although I'm not a Yudkowsky doomer, but that aside, so utopianism isn't the same as long-termism, and well, yeah, let me leave it there. I would comment on that. Like, I want to extend that further in a second, but go ahead.
So, as I think you know, utopianism throughout history has oftentimes been bound up with apocalypticism. There's this future. I mean, on certain religious views, there's this future event that we need to pass through. It's this cataclysmic paroxysm at the end of time. But once so passing through that is going to be traumatic and awful and so on. But once we're through it, we get paradise, we get utopia. And so you see basically the exact same thing with long-termism, particularly with respect to AGI. So the whole reason AGI is on the map in the first place is because it was widely thought that it is the vehicle that's going to take us from our present moment, which is miserable and mediocre, to this utopian, paradisiacal world full of astronomical amounts of value in which we get to live forever. We radically re-engineer humanity, we spread throughout space, and so on and so on. And so
let me just interrupt. I'm not sure we defined just for the people who don't do this for full time. I mean, I guess almost everybody knows by now that AGI is artificial general intelligence, but kind of beyond that, there's this idea in this community that although AGI sounds like, okay, now you've got a machine as smart as a human, it kind of signifies something much more than that, because the idea is that once you get to that point, the importance of an evolution of AI, begin to expand and grow respectively, speed up respectively, partly because you can replicate these things without limit in principle, and also because in the singularitarian view, like when technological evolution gets to the point where the AI can improve itself, you're going through this threshold where suddenly it gets smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter. So, okay, that's a footnote, and now you can go on.
Yeah. So, on the, to generalize a bit, but this is accurate, for long-termists, pretty much everything is an engineering problem. So, all of the problems we're facing today, the so-called problem of aging and so on, all of these are just engineering problems. Well, what makes a good engineer? Intelligence, which is a concept that turns out to be very not well defined. But okay, so putting that in scare quotes, intelligence, that's what makes a good engineer. Therefore, if you have a super intelligence, you have a super engineer. And you have a super engineer, then you get everything you possibly want. In fact, they literally refer to the creation of the future they hope to bring about as, in Bostrom's words, Nick Bostrom, paradise engineering. And so the idea is, so once you get AGI, once you get human level AGI, chances are it's going to self-improve. Then you get superintelligence. So that's a subtype of AGI. ASI is what they sometimes call it, artificial superintelligence. Once you get ASI, two things are probably going to happen. One, it's going to give us everything we want. So then we get to colonize space, we get to live forever, and so on and so on. Two, the second possibility is that it's going to kill everyone by default as a result of an unintended consequence of misaligned goals. That is, goals that are misaligned with what they really mean is goals that are misaligned with the particular long-termist view. So this is why for long-termists and people in the TESCREAL tradition more generally, AGI is so important. Once you get AGI, you get superintelligence. If superintelligence is properly value aligned, we get everything. We get paradise. If it's not, then not only do 8 billion people die, but all of the value, the astronomical, near infinite amounts of value that could have existed in the future, none of that will exist. And on their view, as I discussed in great detail in part 2 of my book, on their view, that the opportunity cost, the loss of all of that value associated with the state or condition of being extinct, that constitutes by far the greatest aspect, the number one reason why human extinction would be an unthinkable moral catastrophe. So for them, AGI is extremely important. And so you could see then how the utopianism is bound up with the apocalypticism. And really what changed is you had people initially who were just utopians about AGI. So Yudkowsky would be a good example. And then over time, they started to realize, oh, actually, if we build the system that is wildly more, quote unquote, intelligent than us, we might have some very serious problems trying to control it. And consequently, utopia might not be the default outcome. Apocalypse, in a secular sense, in particular, meaning total human extinction, that might be the default outcome. And so that's how the doomer camp within that TESCREAL movement.
Now, okay, but here's one thing I don't totally get. So you are saying that TESCREAL, whatever, is in some sense a coherent thing. We've already talked about, okay, the T is transhumanism, which is like belief in the fusing of technology with biology to transform the nature of human experience, extend life, brain chips, everything. That's that. Now, E is extropianism. It's kind of obscure. The C, cosmism, kind of obscure. Let's don't get hung up on those now. The S was the singularitarianism, which we discussed. TSC, then E, the EA and L at the end. We've talked about effective altruism, longtermism. What is the R?
Rationalism.
Oh, rationalism. Now that's interesting. Yeah. So the rationalist community is, that officially entered the lexicon about a year ago when the New York Times declared it an official part of the lexicon and wrote about the whole controversy with Scott Alexander, not his real name, I guess we now know, but the Slate Star Codex guy who now has a Substack newsletter with a slightly different name. He was doxxed, kind of, right? And that led to a bunch of publicity, but he was one of the leaders of the rationalist movement, which is just, let's be rational, right? They really like Bayesian analysis in particular. And you see a connection with utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is kind of, let's have an ethics we can be rational about, as opposed to this Kantian nebulousness and, virtue ethics and this stuff that's so hard to like in principle, you could quantify your analysis if you're a utilitarian. So then rationalism, which, like utilitarianism, would not seem to have an inherent connection to the other stuff, right? You could be a rationalist, utilitarian, dystopian, pessimist about technology in principle. In fact, come to think of it, that's what I consider myself almost. But you're saying as it happens, and is this just like a sociological fact that it played out this way? You're saying as it happens, the rationalist and utilitarian elements fed into these other things that you're kind of objecting to more directly, in a sense, that have these more obvious policy implications and values implications?
Yeah, so there are multiple reasons to think of the bundle as a bundle. One is that I don't think you can properly understand why there is a race to build AGI right now without taking into consideration all of these different letters in all the different ideologies that are represented in the acronym. So rationalism has played a huge part.
Okay, but let me just interrupt you because there's an objection that must have occurred to people now. You just said, and it was something I was going to ask you about, and we've kind of alluded to, but you said, if you're going to understand the race to build AGI and how it grows out of this bundle TESCREAL, but we've already said that the people most opposed to the race to build AI are also part of this bundle. Yudkowsky. I mean, that's the fundamental paradox I don't totally get in your acronym, because you also say Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are part of it. Well, Peter Thiel is an accelerationist. Elon Musk, well, he acts like an accelerationist, but he calls himself an AI doomer, and he did call for a pause in AI. Yeah. So you seem to be encompassing these two polar opposites into like a single movement or something.
Yeah. So I absolutely agree that at first glance it looks confusing, but it's not. So all of these individuals want AGI. They differ on the probability of apocalypse, of existential catastrophe and human extinction if we build AGI in the near future. So people like Bostrom are, he was interviewed, he was asked on stage back in 2017. So a few years after he wrote in his book Superintelligence, published in 2014, that the default outcome of superintelligence is doom. To quote him, he was asked, should we build superintelligence? And he did not hesitate to say yes. People like Yudkowsky, they absolutely want AGI. They just think so one way to understand.
But he says he doesn't. He says bomb the chip plants, right? He says he does not want AGI.
One way to understand it is you've got AI safety research on the one hand, and AI capabilities research on the other hand. Capabilities research is trying to build in AGI. Safety research is trying to figure out how to build it in a safe way. And long-termists, doomers in particular, see our current situation as a desperate race between these two fields. And on their view, so if time goes this way, you've got capabilities research here, safety research here. Capability research is way ahead of safety research. So what they want is the reverse to be the case. And so what they're saying is slow down capabilities research as much as necessary for safety research to take the lead. And as soon as you have that configuration, then it's pedal to the metal, build AGI as soon as possible, because AGI is the key to paradise.
But I thought Yudkowsky's argument was that, look, if it's this much smarter than us, we can't win. It's like we know which animal winds up in the zoo and one is smarter than the other. Sometimes it sounds like end of argument, although I know he has more sophisticated arguments than that, which I haven't yet managed to grasp. But Wright, I mean, he wants to end, I thought, progress in AI research. He thinks we're doomed if we get to AGI, I thought.
So I do not believe that is his view. I haven't.
Is it his stated view? Is it what he says? I think it's what he says. No.
No. So I think what his view is. So you've got accelerationists on one side, doomers on the other side. He is at the very far extreme of the doomers. So just to point that out to begin with. But his view, consequently, is that capabilities research. So if you zoom out, you see that capabilities research is so far ahead of AI safety. Maybe we need like a century or maybe 300 years to properly do safety research. And so this is the extent to which someone believes that we're on the verge of total annihilation comes down to some extent to how they see the divergence between capabilities research and safety research. So on his view, capabilities research is so far ahead that a complete and total indefinite, so this is his stated view in his Time magazine article, indefinite ban, complete ban on these frontier models. That is the only way we're going to avoid apocalypse in the future. So what is the point of it's not a permanent ban, it's an indefinite ban. And what he wants is for there to be this indefinite ban so that the safety research has plenty enough time to catch up. And as soon as safety research takes the lead, moves ahead of capabilities research, then, absolutely he's going to want to move ahead with AGI as soon as possible. Because if you have a configuration where safety research is ahead of capabilities research, what is the implication? The implication is that you get a value-aligned, so-called value-aligned AGI. And if you have a value-aligned AGI, then you say, cure aging, it does that. You say colonize space, it thinks for about 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds, goes, okay, I figured out exactly how to send out these von Neumann probes in every direction and so on. And so I think, Bostrom, in contrast to Yudkowsky, so far as I can tell, so far as I can infer from what he said recently, capabilities research isn't that far ahead of safety research. And so he was recently asked in interview what he thinks about like the pause AI movement. And he said, well, I think it's good. We should be taking these risks seriously. But he said, I'm worried that the pause AI movement is going to result in a kind of stigma, a taboo against AGI. That's going to result in a situation where once AI safety is ahead of AI capabilities, nobody's going to want to build an AGI because there's this taboo against it. And in his view, and he's explicit about this, that would be an existential catastrophe, failing to create AGI. So this is an example of a doomer.
That seems incredibly implausible to me. I got to say, the idea that you can ultimately stop this stuff from evolving seems to me crazy, but go ahead.
Yeah, so anyways, this is their view, and I think this is the key difference between accelerationists. Well, there's a little bit more to say about that, but one of the two main differences between accelerationists, in particular effective accelerationists, EAC, as they pronounce the acronym, and the more traditional doomer sort of long-termists, is really it's their probability estimate of the chance of doom in the near future. And in fact, for a lot of accelerations, they'll say the default outcome, contra Bostrom and Yudkowsky and so on, is utopia. And so actually this field of AI safety is just kind of irrelevant. What we need is just to advance capabilities research, ensure that it's open source, that and so the free market can work its magic. Because if you have the AGI systems that are open source, then you get a whole bunch of AGIs that emerge roughly around the same time. Then you get a balance of terror. And so, their view is, okay, the free market is the solution to the AI safety problem. And all of that research is just kind of irrelevant. Let the free market solve the problem, plow ahead with capabilities research. So all of this is just basically just part of the same transhumanist, cosmist, rationalist, and so on tradition. They just differ on this key issue about their so-called P-doom, probability of doom, if AGI is built in the near future. So I hope that makes sense.
I want to explore that a little further. But first, let's make sure we've gotten to your moment of transformation and flesh that out fully. I think I keep steering you off course. I want to understand your personal transformation as fully as possible. And also, is there any kind of sociological backstory or political backstory? Like, did you have like a bitter priority dispute with anybody in the movement or anything, or like they stole money from you, or no?
No, nothing like that at all. I mean, really, it was, on the one hand, it was sort of realizing, okay, this utopian vision, it's just like hyper-capitalistic, it's Baconian, it's all about subjugating nature, maximizing. It's, there's, utopia is, one could argue, there are nuances to this as well, but one could argue utopia is sort of inherently exclusionary. So who gets left out of the long-termist, the TESCREAL sort of utopia? One of the most striking features of the TESCREAL literature is that there's virtually zero reference at all to what the future could, and more importantly, should look like from the perspectives of like Afrofuturism or indigenous traditions or Islam. Islam is growing in the world. In a real sense, the future is religious, not atheistic, And so just all, feminism and queerness and disability and so on, where do these fit in, there's just no reference whatsoever to these different sort of approaches, different ways of thinking, modes of
they're
thought.
Not, but they're not kind of obviously incompatible with the future they envision, right? I got to assume that if you ask Nick Bostrom, is it fine to be gay or choose your gender in the world of the future on one of the 1,000 planets that our descendants live on? I assume he'd say fine, sure. And I don't quite get the tension there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, if you read, for example, his article, Why I Want to Be Post-Human When I Grow Up, I mean, it is deeply classist. His vision of what it means to become post-human and so on. It's not, I mean, explicitly, it's not watching sports.
What's a classist? You don't get to watch sports? Okay. I'm with you,
sports,
buddy. I'm with you. Let's bring these guys down. But
you play jazz and cogitate philosophical issues rather than, having a beer with your buddies. I mean, this is just one example, but
but he's not saying that's mandatory, is he? Or is he?
I mean, I think for probably him, if there are certain things like disability in utopia, it's not utopia anymore.
Well, okay, but he is saying that you would have the option of changing any disability you have. That's not the same as discriminating against disabled people, right?
Yeah. So I don't know. It's I think if part of the problem is that if one does not design the future with people rather than with other groups, other perspectives, and so on, rather than for these other perspectives, you're probably not going to get a good outcome. And what, again, part of why it's significant that it's so striking, there's virtually no reference to what the future should look like from all of these different perspectives, is that when one is designing a future and these other perspectives aren't even on one's radar, not even there, on dotting the horizon of recognized possibility, then you're just going to get a future that is not going to be inclusive. And so, I mean, there's lots more to say about this. But maybe another thing I wanted to stress is in addition to worries about what exactly this future would look like, also, so here's a side note. I'm looping back to what I just said. Even what the future should look like from the perspective of non-human animals. I mean, McCaskill is explicit in his book that given the existence of wild animal suffering, our destruction of the environment might be net positive. And so, is there even a place for not just indigenous communities and other groups of humans and cultures and so on, but even the natural, so-called natural world around us? It's not even clear that there is. Maybe the ultimately what they would want is to just digitize everything. Then you get to control how much suffering there is, all the subjective experiences that being had. So that's part of the issue. But the another realization that played a significant role in me parting ways with this community that I was a part of for a decade was sort of studying the history of utopian movements that became violent and realizing that a lot of these movements had at their core two main ingredients. One was, of course, this utopian vision of the future in which we live forever, we've abolished suffering, and there's near infinite or infinite amounts of value. And the other is a kind of utilitarian mode of moral reasoning. And when you take those and you put them together and you say, okay, let's say the ends can sometimes justify the means. Well, here in this situation, the ends are a literal utopia of just endless value. Well, what exactly is off the table? And so this was, Peter Singer himself has echoed this, citing some of my articles. This was the main thrust of my 2021 EN article, basically saying that long-termism, the ideology itself, contains the ingredients necessary to, quote unquote, justify in the minds of true believers, like I was, extreme measures that are violent, maybe even genocidal. That sounds maybe hyperbolic. I don't think it is.
Wait, Peter embraced that critique?
Yeah.
Of long-termism? Okay.
Yeah. So he wrote an article for Project Syndicate in which he recapitulated these exact points and said, I mean, the gist was long-termism itself, the ideology, could be dangerous. And he drew an analogy with Marxism. Marx never envisioned, his views being misused and abused, but they ended up enabling, mass atrocities. And so he was concerned about long-termism for exactly that reason. And so, back in 2021, when I initially articulated these concerns, my worries were hypothetical. But if you fast forward to this year, and I should say they were hypothetical, and they drew from a scenario that was put forward by a Swedish mathematician, statistician named Ole Hagström in his book, Here Be Dragons. Hagström is very sympathetic with long-termism, but at one point in the book, he worries that if there's a politician who can do the arithmetic and they take Bostrom's argument to heart, and there's a 1 in a million chance that some lunatic is in Germany and threatens the vast and glorious future that awaits us, to quote Toby Ord, then that politician might feel justified in just nuking all of Germany. And so this was a hypothetical concern. But if you fast forward to this year, you literally have people like Yudkowsky arguing in the pages of Time magazine that the AGI apocalypse is so, is just around the temporal corner, and that if we create AGI, the entire vast and glorious future, to quote Yudkowsky, our glorious transhuman future, that will be utterly annihilated. And so we should bomb data centers. Military should be willing to bomb data centers to prevent the AGI apocalypse, even at the risk of triggering thermonuclear war. And when he was asked on social media, quote, how many people are allowed to die to prevent AGI, end quote, parentheses, from being developed in the near future, his response was basically everyone. He literally says this.
Well, that would kind of defeat the purpose, wouldn't it?
So, I mean, on his view, thermonuclear war is probably not going to be an existential catastrophe. And I think the best science backs him up. So it's probably not, there was a study from 2020 that found that an all-out
Yeah.
thermonuclear exchange between the US and Russia would kill 5 billion people. So that's a
Yeah.
3 billion, 3 billion people who would survive and be able to carry on civilization and ultimately. And so he said, he said, as long as we stay above the minimum viable human population, then quote, there's still a chance of reaching the stars someday. And so that is exactly the kind of thing that I was worried about. And I'll give you one last example. I know I've spoken for a while, but one last example is at an AI safety workshop that was held in Berkeley and run by somebody who works for Yudkowsky's Institute and another person who worked for Open Philanthropy, major EA, long-termist organization. So they organized this workshop and they were talking about ways to slow down the development capabilities research. And a number of people proposed in the meeting minutes, recorded in the meeting minutes, that one possibility is to assassinate AI researchers at OpenAI and DeepMind. And they literally said, quote, be Ted Kaczynski, go to your cabin in Montana and send bombs in the mail to OpenAI and DeepMind. So this is exactly the kind of, you get utopian thinking plus a broadly utilitarian mode of moral reasoning. You put them together, what's off the table? Assassinations, thermonuclear war. No. And so that was what I was worried about. We live in a world that I was warning about back in 2021.
Okay.
So that's another reason that I left long-termism and thought like this is dangerous. This is not, something's gone wrong with the view if it could potentially justify in the minds of true believers extreme measures like violence.
Yeah, I mean, almost all views can potentially justify something or other. But anyway, let me say we've been talking for almost an hour.
Can I mention something real fast, if you don't mind?
Just if it's really fast.
You're totally
unless
right.
it's the kind of thing I could use to keep people on the edge of their seats as I bring down the paywall, which I'm about to do, but go ahead.
So I would just say that, yes, any belief system can be taken to some kind of extreme.
Yeah.
My point is that this utilitarian reasoning and the utopianism, those are right at the very core of long-termism. Those are essential features of long-termism.
Wait, what are the words that are together at the core? Wait, say that again. I missed it.
Utopianism and basically utilitarianism. So
Utopianism.
those are right there at the core. If you get rid of those, you kind of get rid of, long-termism is just not long-termism anymore. And so that's why I think long-termism is different from like all of these other ideologies.
I think I will want to challenge that on the other side of the paywall. But so we've been talking close to an hour. As regular listeners and viewers know, as a rule, there's this pretty long public part of the podcast. However, we have to pay the rent for the Nonzero newsletter, the Nonzero podcast. So the rest of this, and I plan to go on for quite a while, I think we both got time, will be available only to paid subscribers to the Nonzero newsletter, which you can become by Googling Nonzero and Substack or by clicking a link in the show notes in your podcast app. Once you've done that, you can go to the post for the latest podcast, like this one. Go to the Substack. You can find the post as a paid subscriber. And at that point, you can, by clicking something on the right-hand side of the post, set up a feed that will allow you forevermore to just automatically have access to these overtimes, and there will be no more hassles. Plus, you'll know that you're supporting a cause that presumably you want to support. If you don't, then maybe this paying up is not for you, but you'll be supporting the Nonzero newsletter, the Nonzero podcast. Thanks to everybody who has stayed with us this far, whether or not you're going to follow us. Thanks to those who are going to follow us. Are you happy, Émile? There's nothing you want to add quickly before for the vast public viewing audience, before we move behind the velvet rope?
No, just to thank you for having me on before we continue the conversation.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
Yeah, thanks.
This
Great.
will go on for a while, so we're heading into overtime.